The woman in the plain blue dress and the white prayer cap had not touched her notepad in almost a minute. She stood by the corner booth of a diner off Route 30, coffee pot still warm in her hand, watching four strangers in tailored suits argue over a stack of papers they assumed no one else in the room could read. In 20 minutes, the man at the head of that table, a man whose signature alone moved more money than every farm within 20 miles combined, would ask her name like his career depended on the answer. Because the waitress they had waved off twice already had spent 6 years reading fraud out of numbers for a living, and the folded paper now creased into her apron pocket was about to end more than just a meeting. She refilled a coffee cup 2 tables over. She did not look at the suits again. Not yet. The diner sat where the highway bent toward the covered bridge, close enough to the Yoder farm that Hannah could walk home in the time it took a kettle to boil. Walt Kessler had owned the place for 30 years and hired her 3 years ago without asking why an Amish woman wanted a job pouring coffee for English customers instead of staying home to can peaches. He'd learned not to ask most things. She showed up on time, she remembered orders without writing half of them down, and she never once complained about the men who stared at her cap like it was a costume. Thursday mornings were slow until they weren't. The bell over the door rang at 9:15, and 4 people walked in wearing the kind of suits that never saw a barn. Hannah knew the type before they opened their mouths. Phones already out, voices pitched to fill a room, shoes too clean for a county with more mud than sidewalk. She sat them in the corner booth because it was the only one big enough, and because Walt liked business people near the window where passing traffic could see the diner wasn't empty. "Coffee 4, said the oldest of them, not glancing up from his phone. Silver hair, a watch that cost more than her father's tractor, a voice that assumed the world arranged itself around his schedule. Thomas Calder. She'd learned the name within the hour, though by then it would already mean something to her that it didn't mean to anyone else at that table. She poured. She left. She came back when the coffee ran low, the way she always did, moving through the room like furniture that occasionally spoke. That was the arrangement people made with her, without meaning to. The cap did the talking before she ever opened her mouth. It said plain, said simple, said harmless, and most days she let it say whatever it wanted, because it was easier than correcting strangers who'd already made up their minds. 6 years ago, she would have corrected them. 6 years ago, she'd worn blazers that cost more than this diner's monthly rent and walked into boardrooms where men like Thomas Calder listened when she talked, because she'd made her name proving that men like Thomas Calder lied. She didn't think about that name anymore, mostly. In her apron pocket, worn soft from 3 years of the same fabric against the same hip, sat a mechanical pencil with faded engraving along its barrel. Initials, and beneath them, the ghost of a company name she hadn't spoken aloud since she came home. She kept it out of habit, not memory. Habit, she told herself, the way she told herself a lot of things about the life she'd left. Her father had needed her. That part was true and simple and enough most days to answer any question anyone asked about why she'd come back. The stroke had taken the strength from the right side of his body and half his ability to work the land he'd worked for 40 years, and someone had to be there who understood both worlds well enough to talk to the doctors and still know how to milk a cow before dawn. She had been the only one who could do both. She told herself that was the whole reason. It wasn't. But she hadn't finished deciding what the rest of the reason was, and 3 years hadn't been long enough to make her. The suits ordered eggs, toast, more coffee. Hannah refilled cups and cleared plates and stayed close enough to hear without seeming to listen. A skill she'd learned long before she ever wore a cap. In conference rooms where the real information always came out after someone thought the recorder was off. "The Sentinel numbers came back," said the woman with the tablet. Elena Reyes, CFO, Hannah would learn, sliding a folder toward Calder. Soil contamination on 4 of the 6 parcels, enough to trigger the blight clause. All four Amish owned, Calder asked. All four. The fourth man at the table, younger, restless, tapping his pen against the table in a rhythm that made Hannah's jaw tighten without her deciding it should, leaned back and smiled like he'd already won something. Daniel Voss, VP of Land Acquisitions, though nobody said his title out loud. She read it off the badge clipped to his jacket when she cleared his plate. Then we don't need 6 signatures, he said. We need 4. And the other 2 parcels. Udry, Fisher and Zook won't sell voluntarily, Voss said. Doesn't matter. Once the county designates the corridor as blighted, the offer isn't voluntary anymore. It's fair market minus remediation costs, which, with Sentinel's numbers, is about 40 cents on the dollar. Hannah kept moving, kept pouring, kept her face arranged into the pleasant nothing she'd practiced for 3 years. Fisher and Zook. She knew both families. She'd sat at both tables for Sunday dinner more times than she could count. And 4 Amish-owned parcels with sudden soil contamination findings timed exactly to a corridor a developer needed clean. She'd seen that shape before. Not similar, that shape exactly, down to the phrasing of the clause. She set the coffee pot down on the warming plate harder than she meant to. 6 years ago, in a glass office 40 floors above a city, these men would never think to associate with a woman in a plain dress. Hannah Yoder had built a career finding exactly this. Whitcomb and Sears hadn't hired her because she was Amish. They hadn't known, not until the trial made it a headline neither the firm nor she had wanted. They'd hired her because she could look at a spreadsheet and see the lie underneath the numbers, the way other people saw a sentence underneath punctuation. Her specialty had been land fraud, appraisal manipulation. Shell companies built to hide who actually profited when small landowners got squeezed out by objective reports that were never objective at all. The case that made her name, the one that also, eventually, cost her almost everything else, had been called Kestrel Run. A different county, a different developer, the same clause about soil contamination triggering forced sale at reduced value. She had traced the falsified reports back through 4 shell companies to a single appraisal firm that had learned to manufacture exactly the numbers a client needed and exactly the paperwork to make those numbers look independent. The appraisal firm had been called Sentinel Valuation Partners. She had not misheard it. She went back to the coffee station and stood very still for 4 full seconds, long enough that Walt glanced over from the grill and mouthed, "You good?" She nodded. She was not entirely sure that was true. Sentinel had settled the Kestrel Run case quietly, the way firms like that always did. A fine, no admission of wrongdoing, a promise to reform practices that nobody outside the room ever checked on. She'd testified for 11 hours across 3 days. She remembered the partner's face when the numbers she'd traced put his signature on paperwork he swore he'd never seen. She remembered less clearly the 6 months after the trial when her fiancé told her he couldn't keep living with someone who brought her work home in her nightmares. And the year after that, when her mother called to say her father had collapsed in the barn, and Hannah had realized, somewhere over Pennsylvania, on a train she'd taken because she couldn't remember how to drive anymore, that she didn't know which version of herself was supposed to walk through that farmhouse door. She had walked through it anyway, 3 years now, long enough that most people in the district had stopped asking where she'd been, long enough that she'd almost convinced herself the pencil in her apron pocket was just a pencil. "Ma'am?" Voss's voice, flat, already annoyed, cut through the memory like a hand snapping fingers in front of her face. "We're going to need this table a little longer. You can come back." "Of course," Hannah said, and started to move the coffee pot away. "And bring the check separate from the tip line. We're expensing this." "Yes, sir." She refilled 2 cups at the counter, watching the corner booth in the mirror behind the pie case. Calder was reading something on his phone. Reyes had the folder open again, running a finger down a column of numbers. Voss was talking with his hands, the way men talked when they were selling something to people who'd already agreed to buy it. And once the corridor's designated, we don't even need Fisher and Zook to sign anything, Voss was saying. Eminent domain does it for us. County's motivated, we've got the infrastructure grant riding on groundbreaking by spring. Sentinel's report gives us the contamination trigger. The trigger gives us the blight designation. The designation gives us the corridor. Clean line, no lawsuits, no headlines about kicking Amish families off their land. Just 4 quiet closings and 2 condemnations nobody outside the county will ever hear about. And Sentinel's confident in the numbers, Calder said. Not quite a question. Sentinel's been doing this for us in 3 states, Voss said. They know how to make a report survive a challenge. Hannah's hand tightened around the coffee pot handle. They know how to make a report survive a challenge. She had heard almost that exact sentence once before, years ago, read into a court record from an email she'd subpoenaed. Survive a challenge wasn't a phrase honest appraisers used. It was a phrase people used when they were building something to withstand scrutiny rather than reflect truth. She thought about the Fisher farm, the one with the crooked oak her own children used to climb, if she'd had any. She thought about old Eli Zook, 81 years old, who still walked his fence line every morning because his hands didn't know how to be still. She thought about her father, half his strength gone, sitting at the kitchen table 2 miles from here with a stack of mail he could no longer read fast enough to catch a deadline buried in legal language, designed so a plain man wouldn't catch it in time. 4 parcels, 40 cents on the dollar, a report built to survive a challenge. She had spent 3 years telling herself she'd put that life away. She had not put away the part of her that could still see the shape of a lie at 50 feet. The lunch rush thinned the diner enough that Walt didn't need her at the counter for a stretch, and Hannah found herself standing near the corner booth again with a coffee pot she didn't entirely need to be carrying. Reyes had stepped away to take a call. Voss was on his laptop, angled just enough that Hannah, refilling the sugar caddy at the next table, could see a spreadsheet with a header she recognized before she consciously decided to read it. Sentinel Valuation Partners, Corridor 9 Remediation Estimates. 4 rows, 4 parcel numbers, 4 contamination findings, each one specific enough to look real and vague enough to be unfalsifiable by anyone without a lab, unless you knew, the way Hannah knew, that the exact phrasing, elevated subsurface hydrocarbon indicators consistent with historical agricultural runoff, was boilerplate language Sentinel had used in at least 6 prior reports she'd personally examined under oath. Word for word, the kind of copy-paste laziness that fraud investigators lived for and fraudsters never expected anyone plain enough to notice. She didn't have her old tools. She didn't have a subpoena or a lab or 3 associates pulling comparable filings. She had a coffee pot, an apron, and a mechanical pencil that hadn't done real work in 3 years. It was enough to start with. She went to the register, tore a paper placemat in half, and wrote, fast in the shorthand she used to fill legal pads at 2 in the morning, the 4 parcel numbers from memory, the report language she'd just read, and beneath it, 3 lines that would mean nothing to anyone at that table and everything to anyone who'd ever cross-examined an appraiser. Same firm, same boilerplate, same clause structure as the Kestrel Run case, years back. Ask Sentinel who signed the field inspection. Ask if anyone actually walked the land. She folded it twice, small enough to fit in a palm. She did not let herself think too hard about what she was about to do, because 6 years of instinct told her that thinking too hard was how good people talked themselves out of the one moment that mattered. Reyes came back from her call. Calder set down his phone. Voss closed the laptop and reached for the check folder Hannah had left on the table's edge, the way a man reaches for something that belongs to him by default. "We're about ready to head to the site office," Calder said, mostly to Voss. "You've got the county commissioner at 2? 2:15. I'll walk him through the Sentinel findings, get the blight motion on next week's agenda. Voss glanced up as Hannah approached the table, and something in his face arranged itself into the particular blankness people reserved for staff they'd already stopped seeing as people. We're all set here. Before you go, Hannah said, and set the folded placemat on the table beside Calder's coffee cup, you might want to look at this. The table went quiet, in the specific way rooms go quiet when something has happened that doesn't fit the shape anyone expected. Voss recovered first, because men like Voss always did, fast and loud enough to cover the half-second where he hadn't known what to do. What is this? Something about your Sentinel report, Hannah said. Even. Plain. The way she'd learned to say true things in a district that valued a quiet voice over a raised one. Voss picked up the paper before Calder could reach it, unfolded it with the impatient flick of a man swatting away an interruption, scanned 4 lines and laughed, short, surprised, ugly at the edges. Did you write this? I did. This is a placemat. He turned it toward Reyes, half showing, half performing. She's citing case law on a placemat. I'm not citing case law, Hannah said. I'm telling you where to look before you sign something you'll regret. Sweetheart. Voss set the paper down, flat, deliberate, the way a man sets something down when he wants everyone to understand he's finished with it. This is a 9-figure land acquisition with 3 law firms and a state agency involved. I don't need real estate advice from the coffee girl. Daniel. Reyes, quiet, a warning shape in one word. No, I'm serious. He wasn't looking at Hannah anymore, which was its own kind of answer. He was looking at Calder, playing to the only audience that mattered to him. You want to walk the county commissioner through a corridor timeline using notes from a waitress who probably learned the word contamination an hour ago. We table this. We go to the site office. We do our jobs. He picked the paper back up, crumpled it into a loose fist, and set it beside his coffee cup like a piece of trash waiting for a tray. No offense, he said, in the tone men used when the words that followed no offense were always precisely the offense. This isn't your world. Go back to your tables. We'll handle the corridor. The diner had maybe 9 other people in it. 2 truckers at the counter who'd gone still over their pie. A young mother in the second booth, her toddler's fork frozen halfway to a plate of pancakes. Walt at the grill, spatula in hand, not moving. Hannah's co-worker Debbie, wiping down the pass-through, close enough to hear every word. 9 years old inside her, before the firm, before the blazers, before the courtroom. A smaller, plainer Hannah remembered exactly what it felt like to be told this isn't your world by someone who had never once wondered what her world might contain. She had felt it from English customers who assumed her community couldn't read a menu. She had felt it differently from partners at Whitcomb and Sears who complimented her accent like it was a party trick. She had thought, coming home 3 years ago, that she was done being underestimated by people who mistook plainness for emptiness. She was not angry. Anger wasn't the word for what moved through her, steady and cold as well water. It was closer to certainty. You should smooth that paper back out, she said, before you leave. Voss didn't. He stood, buttoned his jacket, reached for his laptop bag. Tom, I'll meet you at the car. Calder hadn't moved. He'd been watching the exchange with the particular stillness of a man whose entire career ran on reading rooms for information other people missed, and something about the last 30 seconds had snagged his attention the way Voss's confidence hadn't. He reached over without quite deciding to, and picked up the crumpled paper from beside Voss's abandoned coffee cup. He smoothed it flat against the table with 2 fingers. He read it once, fast, the way executives read things. Then he read it again, slower, his eyes stopping on the second line, the way a man's eyes stop on a name he half recognizes in an obituary. Same firm, same boilerplate, same clause structure as the Kestrel Run case, years back. Elena. His voice had changed register entirely, quieter, and somehow that made everyone at the table sit straighter than his loud voice ever had. "Pull up the Kestrel Run settlement, the Sentinel one, out of Chester County." "The name means something to you?" Reyes asked, already reaching for her tablet. "It should mean something to Sentinel's insurance carrier," Calder said. "We wrote them into 3 deals on the strength of that settlement, never becoming public knowledge. If someone in this diner just handed me the same report language, word for word, from a case they lost." He looked up. For the first time since he'd walked through the door, Thomas Calder looked directly at Hannah, as though she were a person rather than a function of the room. "What's your name?" "Hannah Yoder." "Do you work for a firm, Ms. Yoder? A law office, an accounting practice, anything I should know about before I finish this coffee?" "I work here," Hannah said. "I pour coffee." "That's not what I asked." She held his gaze. Somewhere behind the counter, Walt had stopped pretending not to watch. "I used to work at Whitcomb and Sears, forensic accounting, land fraud mostly. I left 3 years ago." The name did something to the table that Hannah's plain dress and folded coffee pot had not managed to do in 3 hours of quiet, careful attention. Reyes's head came up sharply from her tablet. "Whitcomb and Sears," she repeated. "You were on the Kestrel Run team. I was the lead investigator. You're Hannah Yoder." Reyes said it like a fact she was checking against another fact already in her hand. And Hannah understood, watching her, that somewhere in Ridgeline's due diligence, buried in a file nobody at this table had thought relevant to a land deal in Lancaster County, her name already existed. "I read your deposition 18 months ago when we were vetting Sentinel as a subcontractor. Our legal team flagged the Kestrel Run settlement and the analyst who broke it. I remember the name because the write-up said you'd left the industry, went—" Reyes stopped herself, some instinct telling her the next word might not be the right one to say out loud in this diner, in front of this woman in this cap. "Went home," Hannah said evenly. "That's the word you're looking for." Daniel Voss had gone very still by the door, his hand on the strap of his laptop bag, his face doing the particular draining thing faces do when a person realizes the ground they were standing on has already given way beneath them and the falling simply hasn't caught up yet. "You're telling me," Calder said slowly to Reyes, though his eyes stayed on Hannah, "that the woman who exposed the exact fraud scheme we're about to replicate in this county is the same woman who just poured me coffee for the last 3 hours?" "That appears to be correct," Reyes said. "I didn't—" Voss started. "You called her the coffee girl," Reyes said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "In front of 9 witnesses and a laptop with Sentinel's remediation estimates still open on the screen." Calder folded the placemat once, carefully, the way a man folds something he has decided is worth keeping, and set it inside his jacket pocket. He stood. He did not raise his voice, and Hannah understood, watching him, that men who never needed to raise their voices were often the most dangerous men in any room, for reasons that had nothing to do with volume. "Eleanor, get legal on the phone. I want every Sentinel report we've relied on in the last 3 years pulled and independently reviewed, starting with Corridor 9. Daniel—" He turned, and something in his face made Voss straighten involuntarily, the way people straighten for men who sign their checks. "You will not be walking the commissioner through anything at 2:15. You will not be walking into that site office at all until I understand exactly how long you've known Sentinel's numbers were compromised, and why the due diligence file on this woman's own testimony never made it to your desk before you built a 9-figure acquisition on the same fraud pattern she already put on the public record." "Tom, this meeting is cancelled," Calder said. "All of it. The corridor motion, the county commissioner, the closing timeline, cancelled, until I know whether I've been about to steal 6 farms using a report I'd have laughed out of the room if I'd known its history. He looked back at Hannah, and something in his expression had shifted from surprise into something closer to respect, though careful, still turning the shape of the last 5 minutes over in his mind. Ms. Yoder, I owe you an apology on behalf of every person at this table, and I intend to make sure this firm's due diligence process explains, in writing, how we missed you. I don't need an apology, Hannah said. I need you to look at the other 2 parcels too. Fisher and Zook never got a report at all. They just got told the corridor was coming, whether they signed or not. Calder nodded slowly. Nobody's taking anyone's land off a report I can't verify myself. You have my word. Your word doesn't mean much to my community, Hannah said, not unkindly, just honest. The way plain speech had always come easier to her than careful speech, even after 6 years of learning to be careful for a living. But I'll take it for now because it's what's on the table. He almost smiled at that. Almost. Voss left first. Laptop bag over his shoulder, face the colour of old dishwater, saying nothing to anyone, as the bell over the door rang behind him. Nobody at the table watched him go. That, Hannah would think later, was its own kind of sentence. Not a raised voice, not a scene, just a room that had already stopped needing him in it. By the time Calder and Reyes settled the check, full price. Plus a tip large enough to make Walt raise an eyebrow at Hannah across the room, the lunch crowd had mostly returned to their pie and their coffee, the way people do when the strange thing that happened in front of them doesn't have anywhere else to go except into a story they'll tell someone tonight. Reyes lingered a moment after Calder walked out to the car. For what it's worth, she said, I read your entire deposition 18 months ago and thought it was some of the cleanest fraud analysis I'd ever seen in a courtroom transcript. I didn't think I'd meet you pouring coffee in Lancaster County. Most people don't, Hannah said. Why'd you leave it? The work, I mean. You were good, more than good. Hannah looked past her, out the window, to where the highway bent toward the covered bridge, and past it toward home. I was good at finding what was broken in other people's lives, she said. I got tired of not knowing what was broken in mine. Reyes studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, the way people nod when they've heard an answer they respect more than they understand. She left a business card on the table beside the check. Hannah didn't touch it, and followed Calder out into the parking lot. What happened after that? Hannah heard only in pieces, the way news travelled through the district, slow, second-hand, filtered through people who trusted her enough to bring it straight to the farmhouse kitchen instead of leaving her to hear it from strangers. Ridgeline's internal review took 11 days. Sentinel Valuation Partners lost every contract Ridgeline had ever given them, and within a month, 2 other developers who'd used the same reports for other corridors in 2 other states quietly did the same. Daniel Voss did not return to the site office. The county's blight motion never reached the agenda. Fisher and Zook were offered fair appraisals from an independent firm neither of them had ever heard of, and neither Eli Zook nor young Aaron Fisher ever learned exactly why the offer that came was honest, only that it was, and that the corridor project was quietly redrawn to avoid their fence lines entirely. Hannah was not there for any of it. She did not go to the site office, did not sit for a second deposition, did not answer the 2 more calls that came to the diner's landline asking for the Yoder woman, before Walt started telling callers, not unkindly, that she wasn't taking business calls at work. Calder's firm sent a letter eventually, thick with legal language and an offer, consulting work, generous, flexible, hers whenever she wanted it. She read it once at the kitchen table, folded it back along its original crease, and put it in the drawer where her father kept letters he intended to answer someday, and mostly didn't. She thought about it more than she told anyone. That was its own kind of honesty, one she didn't owe the district or her father or even herself in full. That some nights, doing inventory at the diner or walking the 2 miles home under a sky so full of stars it made the highway lights look apologetic. She missed the particular clean satisfaction of watching a lie collapse under its own weight in a courtroom. She missed being the smartest person a fraud had ever underestimated. She had been good at that work in a way she had never quite managed to be good at anything since, not the same effortless, singular good. But she also remembered the year after Kestrel Run, the year of nightmares and a fiancé who couldn't sleep beside someone who talked in her sleep about shell companies. The year she'd stopped being able to name what she was for beyond being right. She remembered standing in the doorway of her father's hospital room with him 3 years ago, half his face, still learning how to smile again, and understanding for the first time in a decade exactly what she was for. Both of those things were true. She had stopped expecting, somewhere in the last 3 years, that only one of them could be. On the Saturday after Ridgeline's letter arrived, Hannah walked the 2 miles home a little earlier than usual, the light going long and gold over the fields, the way it did in the last stretch before harvest. Her father was on the porch, his cane resting against the rail, watching the horses in the near pasture with the particular patience of a man who had relearned, the hard way, how to sit still. He didn't ask about the letter. Word had reached him too, the way word reached everyone, and he had never once asked her to explain the parts of her life she hadn't offered on her own. "Zook's boy came by," he said instead. "Wanted to thank you for something. Wouldn't say what. Just left a jar of honey on the step and asked me to tell you the bees had a good year." Hannah sat down on the step below him, the wood still warm from the day. Down the lane, she could hear the Fisher Farm's dinner bell, faint, ordinary, the same sound it had made every evening of her childhood and would make every evening after she was gone. "I did something at work this week," she said. "It's a long story. You don't have to tell it if you don't want to." "I know." She turned the mechanical pencil over once in her apron pocket, feeling the worn engraving under her thumb, and did not take it out. "I think I wanted to, though. Just this once." He waited. He had always been good at waiting, better than she was even now. "I used to be someone who found the truth in numbers other people had already decided not to look at too closely," she said. "I thought I'd left that person behind when I came home. Turns out she was just quiet for a while." Her father was quiet himself for a long moment, watching the horses settle for the evening. "Your mother used to say the Lord doesn't waste what he builds in a person," he said finally. "Even the parts we set down for a season, especially those maybe. Do you think I made the wrong choice? Coming back?" "I think," he said, slow, careful, the way he chose every word since the stroke had taught him what it cost to waste one, "that you're still here asking the question 3 years later. Maybe that's its own kind of answer. Maybe it isn't. I've stopped needing to know which." Hannah didn't have a better answer than that, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the old, familiar pressure to find one. She sat on the step as the light went from gold to blue, listening to the horses and the far-off bell, and her father's slow, steady breathing beside her, and let the question stay exactly as open as it was. Monday morning, she tied her apron on before her shift. Same as always, Walt handed her the coffee pot without comment, the way he had every morning for 3 years, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he'd stopped assuming quite so completely that he knew the whole of who he'd hired. The diner filled with the usual mix of truckers and farmers, and occasionally strangers passing through on the highway who would never know, and never need to know, that the plain woman pouring their coffee had once made grown men in tailored suits go pale with a single folded piece of paper. She reached into her apron pocket that afternoon for a pencil to jot down a lunch order, and her fingers found the mechanical one first, out of habit, the worn engraving smooth under her thumb, where 3 years of touching it had rubbed the letters nearly to nothing. She held it for a moment, then set it aside in favor of the ordinary stub Walt kept by the register, and wrote a table's order for 2 coffees and a slice of chouflé pie on the back of a receipt, plain and quick and entirely unremarkable. Some truths, she was learning, didn't need to be chosen once and settled forever. They could be carried quietly, set down when the moment didn't call for them, and picked back up exactly when it did, not proof of a life divided, but of one wide enough to hold both halves without asking either to disappear. She was not the woman who had built a career exposing men like Daniel Voss. Not anymore, not fully. She was not only the woman in the cap pouring coffee on Route 30 either. She was both quietly, the way a field holds last year's furrows even under new planting. Visible if you knew where to look, and none the worse for being covered over with something green and growing. The bell over the door rang. A young couple came in, travel-worn, asking if the diner still served breakfast this late in the afternoon. Hannah picked up the coffee pot, smoothed her apron, and went to find out.